Okay, we'll get this started here, and we may have a few people join as we go along. But welcome to everyone, and thank you so much for coming by and listening to our presentation this morning on why you need to actively grow your flood business. So we'll talk about some reasons not only for you as the agent and the agency, but what's best for your clients as well. I am Sandy Emerson. I'm one of your co-hosts today, and we also have Heidi Keibel as a co-host here. She'll be manning our chat, so if anyone has any questions as we go along, please feel free to ask anything. Hopefully we can answer as we go, and hopefully we'll give you some ideas as to some reasons why it's so important to actually talk to your insureds about flood. This webinar should last about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on what questions we may have at the end. And we'll have a few poll questions as we go along to answer. Hopefully you will participate in that because it gives us an idea of your range of understanding. I also want to remind everybody that this is not a CE class. This is just for information purposes only. And Heidi, if you'd like to go ahead and put up the first poll question.
Thank you, Sandy. Excuse me. Poll question has been launched. And so in our introductory poll, we are kind of looking at what your knowledge of flood insurance is. Are you a beginner where you've never worked with flood insurance? Have you submitted a few applications, but certainly not that many? Maybe you have a relatively good size of your book of business, but you're just looking at ways to grow that book. Or are you an expert and you just like to spend some time with Sandy and I?
That sounds perfect.
We have a lot of people who are answering the question. Sandy, unfortunately, no one is saying that they just like to spend time with you and I.
Well, they will at the end of this day.
We'll change their minds by the time we get over. So let me go ahead and launch these polls. We have a really even split with I've submitted less than 5 applications, and they have a good book of business, but they want to improve and grow their book. So that's rare that we have that even split.
Excellent. And that sounds excellent. Okay, so let me hit a couple of our objectives as we go along here today. We're going to talk about some of the myths and questions that you may come along as you're talking to your insureds. Definitely some of the E&O concerns that could come back to haunt you as an agent and or your agency. Some of the benefits, again, for both your insured and you as the agent and or you as the agency. And kind of an action plan. What can you do to get things going? So the first thing we will talk about is, let me move this here, is what are some of the myths? One of the things we hear all the time is flooding only occurs during hurricane seasons or in coastal areas. Fact number 1, flooding can occur near or from rivers, creeks, any body of water, any low-lying area. The bottom line is if it can rain, it can flood. Flooding is the #1 natural disaster in the U.S. It can happen anytime, any place, anywhere. One other thing to keep in mind, that it can happen without Mother Nature's help. It can be a water main break. It could be a car accident that hit a fire plug and spews water everywhere. It could be a water tower. Some small towns out there still have a lot of water towers, and a train hit it, derails, it could spill water everywhere. So bottom line is, if there can be accumulated water, there easily can be a flood. Next myth we have, flood is included in homeowners policies. Fact, most homeowners policies do not cover flood. In fact, they specifically exclude it. Statistics show that over the course of a 30-year mortgage, a structure built in a special flood hazard area has a 26% chance of flooding versus a 10% chance of incurring a fire. That's huge. That's a huge number when you stop and think about all the fires that make the national news or the local news at 6 o'clock. Flooding can happen in a small area, or it can be widespread. It could be a Harvey or a Katrina, or it could be something that just happens in your neighborhood. It's just a matter of accumulating water. Flooding would not cause much damage. As you can see by that picture, it certainly can cause widespread damage. Fact is, 5 inches of floodwater can equal over $25,000 in damage. Remember that floodwater isn't clean water. It's not like a broken pipe under a sink where all this clean, fresh water is coming into your home or your building. It is coming from the outside. It can have mud, dirt, debris, critters, sometimes even worse, is coming inside that structure. It's not just going to be cleaned up by putting a few fans up and hoping the water goes away. This is stuff that can come in and sit for days depending upon what the event is. A lot of people can't get back to their homes, their buildings right after a flood because it's not accessible. So it could sit there for theoretically a few weeks depending upon the situation. So bear in mind, this isn't an easy cleanup when we start talking about floodwaters. Heidi, would you like to go ahead and put the second poll question up there?
Okay, in our second poll question, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat today. Are you actively and routinely talking to your clients about flood insurance coverage? So certainly we're going to launch ourselves kind of in our next section. And so we kind of want to know what is it that you're talking about with your clients. And we're going to talk about specifically what in that flood insurance you really kind of want to talk about and chat about. So far we have kind of an even split, and let me go ahead and share these results. We have 55% that say no, that they're not actively and routinely talking about flood insurance, and about 45% who say that they are.
Excellent. Heidi, do we have any questions? I don't see anything up there. Anything you want to add so far?
You know, we do not have any questions at this point. However, one thing that Sandy was talking about is really the cost of flooding. And when Sandy gets toward the end of our presentation in the resources, there's a really good resource that can kind of hit home really what the cost of flooding is. And so when we get to that section, hopefully you'll remind me to kind of talk about that particular resource. And it can be powerful not only for the agent, or it can also be just as powerful for your insured, especially if they're kind of sitting on the fence. That's all I have right now, Sandy.
Exactly. One thing I'd like to share with everybody is I'm also a licensed agent. I have been since the early 80s, way too long. So I get that it's difficult to talk sometimes to your insured about flood because it's another expense, or they don't want to hear it, or they don't think it's ever going to happen to them. And we'll have a little bit more of a discussion on that as we go along. But bear in mind that some of the reasons why there are some agencies non-existent right now after Katrina, after Sandy, after Harvey, is because, or partly because, they got hit with E&Os because they weren't having that discussion with their insureds. A lot of people don't realize with Harvey, there were, I don't really want to say mostly, but there were a large number of people in Harvey that were in low-risk zones that had flooding, a lot of flooding. It was widespread, and Harvey wasn't necessarily a coastal storm. It went as far as 250 miles inland in the state of Texas, so it wasn't just people along the coastline that were actually flooded. There was 5 feet of water and in a lot of homes and buildings and commercial buildings in that area. 5 feet. Measure it on the wall. You all can't see me, but I'm actually 5 feet tall. That's a lot of water inside your home. And when you think about what that could be doing, the damage it could be causing, it starts adding up. And again, I keep saying this, it can happen anywhere, any place, any time. It doesn't have to be just coastal or just next to a large body of water. So our next question here is, flood insurance is not available to everyone. The fact is, flood insurance is available to homeowners, to renters, condos, businesses. It's available in high risk and low to moderate risk areas. As long as the community participates in the National Flood Program, there should be a place for flood insurance in every structure in that community. It doesn't matter if the property is in a high-risk floodplain or not. Almost everyone in that community will qualify for flood insurance coverage, and nearly every community throughout the United States participates. There are a few that do not, but for the most part, most areas are easily within the program. So here's a great one that I just absolutely love. It never floods here. I've lived out west. I've lived in Arizona. I've lived in a lot of places that they say it's never going to flood here. One of the biggest liabilities for an agent or an agency is non-disclosure. One of the things that you want to make sure that you're doing is having that initial discussion. Because once again, if it can rain, it could flood. Flooding is overflow. I'm going to backtrack here a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about a basic description of what happens when it does flood. Flooding is an overflowing of water onto land that is normally dry. Floods can happen during heavy rains, when ocean waves come on shore, when the snow melts too fast, or when dams or levees break. Ice jams can also cause flooding. So this pretty much covers the entire United States as what could happen. And again, it's not always Mother Nature. It very easily could be a man-made event that causes the flooding. They can occur quickly and over a long period of time. They may last days, weeks, or longer. Floods are the most common widespread weather-related disaster in this country. I keep saying that over and over again. And bear in mind, constructions of buildings, highways, driveways, parking lots increases runoff by reducing the amount of rain absorbed in the ground. This runoff increases flash flood potential. So if you're in an area that has a lot of growth going on, what used to be an open field may now be concrete, may now be buildings, may now be an industrial park, a subdivision, an apartment complex. Well, that water still has to go somewhere. It's going to run off somewhere, most likely in a lower portion of that particular community. Most new structures have to be built at a higher level because of the floodplain building codes. So what's newer is now going to have the runoff into what's older. And what's older doesn't necessarily mean 30, 40, 50 years ago. It may just be 10 years ago, depending upon how things have been built in that area. So as I said a few moments ago, one of the biggest E&O issues is failure to offer coverage. Liability for non-disclosure. As an insurance agent, you have a responsibility to inform your client about all of the risk and what coverages are available, including flood. Otherwise, your client may hold you accountable if they didn't have the coverage and were never informed. You want to make sure that you're having the conversation, and if they're adamant against purchasing it, make sure you have a waiver for them to sign. The top two errors and omissions, pitfalls, are not offering coverage and not offering the right amount of coverage. Remember, only those with government-backed mortgages in high-risk areas will be required to carry the flood. Don't forget those who are in a non-required area. Just because they aren't required to have a policy doesn't mean they don't need it. There's a huge difference between need and required. These structures that are in the non-required area, these are your voluntary purchases. So don't forget, they're going to have a 30-day wait before the policy becomes effective. And whatever you do, do not tell the customer they are not in a flood zone or that they need minimal limits. Everybody's in a flood zone. There is absolutely no such thing as not being in a flood zone. You may be in a high risk, you may be in a low risk or a moderate risk, but you're still in a flood zone.
So, Sandy, I just know that Chad wanted to ask a question. He just hasn't typed it in yet. So I just know that Chad wanted to know where you can find the waiver that you talked about. Chad, a couple different places that you can find that waiver. If you're quoting, you're on the flood processing website and you type in your quote, close to the bottom you can print out that waiver form. So it's going to include the quote that you quoted and language so that you can present a piece of paper to your client. It's going to give reasons as to why they didn't take the flood insurance coverage. They check the box, and then they have to sign it. And believe it or not, any time that you put a piece of paper in front of one of your policy holders and you make them sign something, it triggers something in their brain that says, you know what, maybe I need to pay attention to this. Some companies have their own form that they like to use. It could just also be simply a statement that's written on maybe your homeowner's quote that says, you know what, I asked if they wanted to talk about flood insurance. The insured declined, and then have it sign it. Just make sure that you have something that documents that you've had that conversation.
Excellent, Heidi. And I'd also add to that, remember, a lot of our insureds talk to their neighbors before they talk, or family members, before they talk to us who are supposed to be the professionals on this product. And they will listen to what their neighbors or what other people have to say about it. And if you're not talking to them, you may not, or they may not be getting the correct information, because as we all know, when it comes to any product with insurance, it seems like our insureds have everyone else telling them what's right or wrong instead of actually asking or talking to the people who actually are in the know. And the same thing happens with flood insurance. A lot of people, I've talked to my own neighbors who have all told me everything wrong there is to talk about when a flood policy, and I happen to live in an X zone, or a low risk zone, but it's amazing of the misinformation that are out there. So the only way they're going to get the correct information is from you. Anything else you'd like to add, Heidi?
That's all I have for right now, Sandy.
Good deal. A couple things then to remember as we're going forward when we are talking about the flood policy. There are specific limitations to the flood policy. For instance, there is no additional living expenses. There is no loss of use coverage built into the policy. The policy is limited to the building and the contents inside it. For the most part, the policy is set up for one building per policy or one policy per building. If the property has multiple buildings on it, then each building will need a separate policy to have it covered correctly. And unfortunately, if they're in a high-risk zone, they're going to individually need their own elevation certificate as well. Both a new application and a renewal policy must be paid in full. There is no payment program currently with the NFIP program. This also applies to endorsements. So if someone needs to increase their coverage, they will need to pay for that up front. There's no billing it at a later time. And note there's specific limitations for basements and enclosures. And these limitations can be found in both the policy and the flood manual. But I would highly suggest you sign up for some more of the webinars. Heidi does some terrific ones on limitations. We have a good group of people out there that do different ones at different times. So just keep an eye on what webinars are coming up in the future, and especially when we start talking about the policy limits and limitations themselves. The flood policy will pay only for direct physical damage to an insured's property, either up to the replacement cost value, or if it qualifies, I should say, or the actual cash value. Remember, though, contents is always actual cash value. There is no replacement cost for contents. And it is subject to the deductible, and as a matter of fact, there are two deductibles with the flood program, one for the building and one for the contents. The preferred risk policy, so we're talking about the people who are in the voluntary market, those that would have a 30-day wait if they came in to talk to you about flood and decided to take out a flood policy. remember that 25 to 30% of all flood insurance claims originate in those low to moderate risk areas, which are your B, C, and X zones. They could also be in the A99 or the AR zones in the regular program. Not only do they have to be in the low risk area, there has to be a specific loss criteria must be met. And one of the things a lot of people, including agents, don't realize, it's not just about the loss that might be paid out from a policy, but also any federal monies that may be paid, whether it's a loan or a grant on that property. And also remember that losses follow the property, not the insured. So if someone had a claim, a flood policy, for instance, had one flood insurance claim payout and one federal disaster relief payment, like I said, including loans or grants, they might not qualify for a preferred risk policy. So it is eligibility not only on location, but also on previous claims. Heidi, do I see a question? Go ahead.
You did. I was just going to interrupt you. So Bradley had a really good question. It's kind of a two-part question. The first is the most amount of paying out. The flood program really divides its structures into residential. So that $250,000 is going to be your building coverage for a single-family dwelling, anything up to a four-family dwelling. When you get to structures such as hotels, motels, assisted living facilities, or even commercial structures, that building coverage goes up to $500,000. So that really depends on what type of structure is being insured. The second part of Bradley's question was about replacement cost. The NFIP can pay replacement cost under what's called the dwelling form. And the dwelling form insures your single-family dwelling, anything up to a four-family. And in order for the NFIP to pay replacement cost, three things have to be true. Otherwise, it's actual cash value. The first is it has to be that single-family dwelling. The second is the insured has to live in that structure for 80% of the year. And the third is they have to insure that policy up to 80% of the replacement cost or the maximum available. So if I lived in a vacation home, then automatically my building coverage is going to be replacement cost because all three of those haven't been met. But if I live in a single family, I live there 80% of the time, I've insured it up to 80% or the maximum available, then in that dwelling form, I can recover replacement cost. And that dwelling form is really the only policy type that is going to have that replacement cost option and those rules. And yes, Bradley, if all three of those is met, they can go up to $250,000 in that building coverage. And that's kind of all of our questions right now, Sandy.
Okay, then we only have a few more slides left. And like I said, just keep asking your questions because not only do we want to have you have the conversation with your insureds about flood, we want to be able to have those conversations here and now too, because if we can get you motivated and get you thinking about flood, it comes easier once it's in your brain, so to speak, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But agency benefits, as you can see by the slide, we have a responsibility, financial, and of course a benefit to your client. Responsibility for providing missing coverage for the property owner. It helps with your account rounding and it leads to higher retention. The flood policies themselves have very little maintenance on it or very little customer service work on it. Unless an insured is changing a mortgage company, most of the time you're not going to be touching that and it's going to stay on the books indefinitely unless something very unusual happens. But they tend to be generally very low maintenance. And to the client, particularly after a loss, it facilitates the recovery. Unlike most disaster assistance, there's no payback of money and the policy holder has more control. if you're talking to your insured, and I used to hear this all the time, why should I bother to buy a flood policy? The federal government will take care of me. And we're not going into details with disaster assistance, but let me assure you, most disaster assistance is actually a loan that does have to be paid back. It's low interest rate, but there is also a qualifying mechanism that has to take place. They just don't give that loan out to anyone. It is a Small Business Administration loan, which is also a federally backed loan, which also means that insured must carry a flood policy in order to get that loan. So it's not as easy as it sounds when it comes to disaster assistance. And even the grant money isn't enough to put anyone back whole ever. So it really is, it behooves the insured to seriously consider having the conversation with you, because again, it can happen anywhere, any place, anytime. So what's your action plan? It sounds simple. The more quotes you do, the more policies you write, the more your sales increase. We've talked to, both Heidi and I have talked to a lot of a lot of agents across the country. And those who are known to be flood experts and have a high number of sales in flood, we ask them, what do you do that the average person doesn't do? And the answer is always the same. I quote a flood policy to every client, or they have that discussion with every client. Whether it's a new client or one that's renewing a property property policy, to do a flood quote every time is in everybody's best interest. And to have it documented that you have had that conversation and have that waiver signed if they're just adamantly against it. And who knows, the next time there's a flooding issue either in your community or somewhere nearby, they may rethink that and come back in. But set up a plan. Target an area maybe that's having a map change or a specific community. Have a good network of realtors, mortgage companies, referrals. And remember to stay current with flood education. The flood program hasn't changed a lot over the years, but it is changing. As we go forward, there are going to be a lot of changes. Have someone in your office, if not everyone wants to learn about flood, have at least one person maybe be that flood expert, so there's someone to go to when they do have questions. But the bottom line is to have a plan. Just make sure that you're talking to the insureds. And I see that we have a question.
We do, and I promise, Bradley, we talk about this with the group, kind of in this vein that you're talking about. So Bradley wanted to really discuss E&O just a little bit. Bradley says he had 3 homes in the Houston flood that did not have coverage. They were all in those preferred risk zones where they can get that low-cost package policy that Sandy talked about. They chose not to carry but had substantial damage. While I have documentation, do they have rights to come back to my agency? Yes, Bradley, they do have rights to come back to your agency. But what we have found is that a lot of times when these cases go to, the carrier or even to, the legal system, because you have documentation that you had that discussion and it really was the insured who made that choice, that kind of takes care of really those particular issues when at all possible. But yeah, they do. But because you've done your due diligence, then you've done what you can do.
To add to that, too, I will say it doesn't matter what line you're talking about, auto, home, flood. A waiver doesn't keep you from having an E&O claim. It helps, though, with the documentation to prove you're doing the right thing. And one of the keys there is don't just do it on a handful of people. It's got to be something consistent. It's got to be you do this for every single person that walks in the door, every single person that you have a file on. It's consistency that makes the difference. So keep that in mind.
And Bradley, the best waiver form that I can suggest is when you go into your flood processing system and you go to the bottom of your quote, there's a button kind of down at the bottom to the right where your premium is. It will bring up a waiver plus the quote that you did. Inside the NFIP manual, Sandy, I think there's a waiver form in there, isn't there?
Yes, I believe there is. It was towards the back. I'm going to stay with that at this point.
And I'm not as familiar with the Accord forms, but, just anything that's going to state that can work. But the Flood Pro system is really the easiest, I think, in order to get that.
It doesn't hurt to include on that waiver whether you have to handwrite it in and have it initialed. If they're carrying less coverage than or 80% of the replacement cost, it's worth making a note of that too, so that at least there's some sort of record that you've suggested that they carry a minimum of $250 or whatever your cost estimator comes up with, rather than only 50% or 60%. I know that I used to have insureds come in that were in the high risk zones and had a government-backed mortgage that was requiring them to carry flood, and they would insist on only carrying what the mortgage amount was, which would be considerably less than 80%. So it's good to note that as well, that you've suggested they carry higher limits, but they're insisting, because they can carry those lower limits if they choose to. Any other questions we have out there that you guys may want to throw at us? We've got one last poll question here, and we're going to be pretty much finishing up. I figured this would be right about 30 minutes.
I don't see any other poll questions, so I can go ahead and launch our final survey if you like, Sandy.
That'll work.
I am going to launch really our final survey, and this survey happens to be 3 questions. I hope that you all participate in that and answer all 3 questions. This just really kind of helps us make sure that we're getting you the information that's helpful to you. And certainly if the information is not helpful, we're going to really try and strive to get you that particular information. So I'm going to leave that up for pretty much until the end so that you have time to go ahead and fill that out.
And what Heidi was referring to earlier, the resources on this back page here, which is FloodSmart. It is our website, National Flood Services website. We have the NFIP publication website. And down at the bottom, if you are an NFS agent, you might want to you really should sign up for the information. And that way, whenever there's a change with the NFIP program or something's going on, you will be emailed that information so that you keep on top of what's going on out there. And Heidi, you had said you wanted to make a point about one of these. I'm not sure I can remember which one.
Yes. I'm going to hijack your screen if you don't mind. So if you could stop sharing.
You got it.
Thank you. Make sure I share the right screen. Okay, we are going to look at a couple of different websites. The first is one that I suggested, which is the interactive cost of flooding, and this is at the agents.floodsmart.gov website. And one thing I really like about this particular website is it shows that interactive cost of flooding. However, if you go into the marketing section, there are a lot of different resources, and Chad was talking about some of the marketing slicks. So NFIP has some of those. So if you go into marketing and then go into participate in campaigns, go ahead and check these out. They have different campaigns that are going on. They have different resources in here. If you're on this particular website, these are all free. They're at no cost. The other website I wanted to make sure that I showed you is actually the National Flood Services website, nationalfloodservices.com. And there's a lot of educational videos that are out here, and they're very short videos that are out here. There's everything out here from soup to nuts, pretty much, that you can think about, any type of video that you're looking for. There's also some slicks and some agency things that you can get in this particular session as well. So if I go into resources, there's things to help start the conversation. There's letters and postcard templates So if you want to go the old-fashioned route and you want to go ahead and just send out a postcard or a letter. If you're more into social media, there's samples that you can use. There's email templates. So there's just a lot of resources, and these are all free of charge. So I can go into letters and postcards. I can kind of choose what I want to use. So let's say that I want a postcard template for commercial properties. I can go ahead and look at those. So don't hesitate to use the things that are out there. So I can just put in the address. I can type in the information. So that's really, kind of where to look for those particular items. And Bradley didn't see the waiver form. Let me see if I can find one for you. Sandy, while I'm searching, anything you'd like to share?
I was going to look here, too, to see if I had one that we could at least put up. While she's looking and I'm looking, I'm going to reiterate, it's all about talking to your insureds. And as someone who had a difficult time back in the day when I was talking to insureds, it was really hard for me to bring that conversation up because I was afraid of the program. I was afraid I didn't understand flood coverage. And it does get easier. The more you talk about it, the easier it does become. So try it. The hardest policy to sell is that preferred risk policy because those are the people that are not being required to sell it. But the easiest to quote is that preferred risk policy. So if you start talking to your insureds, even if you only write one a week for a while, it does become easier. Just sort of let it roll and find your kind of groove, so to speak, and just have that conversation. You may get more no's at first, and then you'll start working in, how to get it into that conversation more. It may not be when you're first quoting that homeowner's policy. It might be a week later or a couple of days later when you get their homeowner's policy actually in. Most agents find it's easier to quote the home and the flood at the same time. But again, do what works for you, but just do it every single time. Any luck there, Heidi?
So the best way that I know to get to one is going through the Flood Pro website. So if you'll excuse me just a little bit, I'm running just a quick little quote here.
I thought I had one saved, but
I thought I did too, but I couldn't find it. So
I think mine was on my old computer.
Through there. And different sites have different ways. No, is it over water? Not over water. Let's do single family. In some of my other sites, I have quotes that are saved, but in this particular environment, I do not. However, if you'll stick with me, I am relatively quick.
Anyone have any other questions while she's looking for that? You guys have a great Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you as well. Anthony, thank you so much. And thank everybody for coming in. And this is the first time we've actually offered this particular webinar, so great to have a lot of people participate. Okay, so if you are on the Flood Pro platform, right down here where the premium is the quote, summary, and waiver form. If you are using Allstate, in the Allstate Flood Connect, look under resources. That's a good place to look. Or you can go ahead and go to the NFIP manual, and I know that they have a waiver form there as well. So if I type in my Google search, NFIP manual, I can go into FEMA. I can go into the manual, and I know that they have it in the manual. Or
think it's under forms. They have kind of a blank one. Or my favorite is to just go to Google and type in flood insurance waiver form.
I was just going to say that. I just did it too.
Yeah, that's my favorite. And it'll take you to the waiver form there as well. And you'll have all kinds of different choices.
They're pretty standard, and they are just meant to give you protection or at least help protect. But again, it's about consistency. Make sure you've got one on every single person in your office that has rejected flood. But make sure you have that conversation with them first.
Yeah, there's a ton of different forms out there that you can use. Anything else that we all have out there that you would like us to answer or show you? Sandy,
I think everybody just wants to get started with Christmas.
Must be.
Again, thanks everyone, and we look forward to seeing you back at some of the others that we do.
Thank you.